Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Impact conversation. Today, I am so thrilled and honored to have Katie Cutting, the founder of Lazy Kitten Productions, joining us for a conversation around the importance of language. And Katie is somebody that I met about a year and a half ago on the set of a film. And Katie was so gracious in how she shared and educated and really just like allowed space for people to elevate their understanding in such a special way. And side note, unbelievable at teaching me how to properly fold, and it's not even fold, an extension cord. I still use those tricks to this day, Katie. So Katie, thank you for being here. I would love if you would share with everyone a little bit about yourself and your journey.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. I love that you still use over under cable wrapping like I taught you.
You did, and I do.
Amazing. Yeah, so like you said, I'm an Edmonton-based filmmaker. I'm a photographer, storyteller, educator, and all-around social advocate. Most of my work centers around queer and trans issues. However, I've really been doing my best to raise the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color within those spaces and with the tools that I have. And I, just to give you a little bit of work, I just finished a documentary that's going to be on TELUS Story Hive, will be on TELUS Optic, and that is called Coffee to the People, which is about a queer Filipinx coffee shop here in Edmonton, Alberta, called Intent. Excuse me, called Intent Coffee.
Wow.
Sadly, Intent is closed now, but you gotta watch the film.
Oh,
So, yeah, but it's great to be here, and I'm glad to be part of the conversation.
thank you. So prior to us going into Solidarity Film Camp, you took the time to sit down with us and really have an important conversation around the language that we use when just in general. It doesn't even matter the communities that we are around, but because we need to ensure we're using inclusive language and language that's really respectful of everybody. And I learned so much in that, 2 hours and then the subsequent 4 or 5 days that we spent together. And I would love if you would just talk a little bit about that importance of language and, when it comes to pronouns and, the spectrum of gender language and those types of things. And also, please, if there is anything that I say while we're talking that I can learn from, that I can do better, I welcome the feedback as well. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Thanks. And honestly, like I know from our past interaction that you take feedback incredibly well, and that you're really open to it. But I think that is a really good point you make with regards to like the conversation that we had, at the beginning of that project. And this is something that I try to do, even though, I was one of many people involved in that project and on that team. One of the things that I try to bring into each of the spaces that I'm involved with is my tendency towards educating people. I love to talk, which is funny because I'm a huge introvert, but I love to info dump. And so being a huge nerd about anything and everything, for me personally, when I came out as trans, that was actually one of the ways that I did a lot of my internal processing, was to kind of manage my own anxieties through being a teacher and being an educator. Most people, that's extra labor for them to do, right? And for me, one of the things that stood out right away was that the English language does not give us the tools to communicate effectively. in many situations. It gives the tools for those, or it has only given usable tools to those who make them or take them, right? A good example of that is, earlier in the second half of the 20th century, little things like the shift towards inclusive job titles and language around, like, when you're talking about a general audience, talking about he or she instead of he, right? Or talking about police person or police officer instead of policeman. But one of the things that obviously leads out is a large swath of the community that doesn't really fit under male or female, or in a lot of ways, that's just down to the history of our society. Our Western European society is what I like to think of it as. One thing before talking about language, I think it's really important to talk about why we view gender the way we do, because in a lot of ways, like, transness in one way, shape, or form has been around for as long as humans have been around. And if you look back over history, you see that while the large portion, or the large large majority of people have fallen under male or female, and who are cisgender, which is the word for folks who stick with the gender or identify with the gender that they're assigned at birth, while cis folks are the vast majority, there are always these little pockets, these little stories that creep up, whether it's through mythology, whether it's through someone being buried with, the opposite gender's clothing or that sort of thing. These stories come to us in our present day, and we look back and go, oh wow, that was really transgressive of them. And what we don't know is how normal it was, how regular it was. But what we do know is that if we look towards, like, the Victorian era, that was kind of the era where Western European culture took over the world, right, through colonialism. And that colonial act ended up using gender as a method of control. So this was where, I was actually just refreshing it this morning, and I actually didn't know this, but pre-Victorian era, it was quite regular in Europe for women to work alongside their husbands. It was quite regular for people to just not care, right? And that's where I've heard that from a lot of people. I'm like, oh, I just want to ignore gender. I'm like, cool, we did that before. And then what happened is the Victorian era came in, and we got very segregated as a society, through gender, through race, through sexuality, through all of these things. And it was largely as a method of control, whether it was in place by the governments of the day or the church or both. And it was also used to control the colonized peoples. So a good example that I learned about during my recent film project is, like, the Filipino culture pre Dutch and Spanish intervention was largely, the language was largely without gendered terminology. And that's something that we, as Western European cultures or powers, brought in. My ancestors, the Dutch, brought in this strong idea of a gender binary. And while, yeah, there was little bits of it here and there, we really enforced it. And now to the point where you have a very entrenched conservative view of such things in that particular country, and in many colonized countries around the world. So all of that to say that our current understanding of gender expression, of gender roles, is not set in stone. It is not really ancient, and it has no further history than to maybe 300 years.
Wow.
And I think that that context is very, very important when we look at language. When we look at talking about inclusive language, and we look at talking about building a just world, right? So start with a context that really it's all made up. And I say that because one of the biggest arguments that people tend to make, who are either unsure or are vehemently against the use of newer pronouns or changing their language at all, is oh yeah, those are just made up words. But the fact of the matter is, language follows the people. It follows the society. And why we're seeing the rise or the return of inclusive language, or the specific creation of inclusive language, is because society is asking for it. Society needs it. So I know that's like this whole like precursor to the conversation about inclusive language itself. But again, I think it's really important to have that context, and to remember that we can look back at history and people have changed their views on everything every 200 years or so. Yeah. So that said, let's talk about pronouns.
Yes.
So you probably know, and I don't know if this makes it into the recording, but at the bottom of my picture, it says Katie, she, or they. So my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. That means that if a person is referring to me, they can say Katie went to the washroom, she'll be right back. Or Katie went to the washroom, they've been in there forever, right? You can use it either way. And for me, I don't mind, I like either. So if you go back a little bit, or if you're new to this whole idea, you may have heard of the concept of preferred, excuse me. You may have heard of this concept of preferred pronouns. And for the most part, there's no such thing as preferred pronouns. There's just your pronouns, right? However, like myself, I prefer she, her to they, them by a margin of like 40 to 60, maybe. And it's a minor thing. However, yeah, I think when you look at, the introduction of gender neutral pronouns back into our society, because they've been there forever, right? They have been used on and off throughout the centuries, and they, them was used as far back that we know of as Shakespeare. Oh yes, and when I say that, I don't mean as a plural or as an indefinite. I mean as a singular definite. So you're talking about one very specific person and you call them they. That goes back further back than a lot of other pronouns do. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Shakespeare's usage of the singular they was actually predates plural they. So yeah, when you look at the grammatical history of it, it's all there. But even if it wasn't, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, we're just talking about ways that people want to interact and interface with each other. Right? So I feel like I ran out of words. So you want to prompt me?
Yeah, I really do. So, okay, so let's talk about the pronouns a little bit further for a moment, because this has been and continues to be a big learning for me and a big adjustment in my language, because I was very accustomed to making the assumption of somebody who was female presenting in my eyes, that I would just default to she, her, and same thing on, he, him. And so number one, changing my mindset to never assume. And if you're unsure, to number one, ask. Or is it, if you don't know, do you, I guess, always ask being the first one, but is they, them a kind of that default if you don't know, so that you are kind of opening that space to have that conversation? Or what are your thoughts around that?
So I want to preface this again, more context, but
Yeah.
I want to preface this by saying that what is common right now in August of 2021 will probably and hopefully not be common 5 years from now.
Right.
And that's because we are going through a lot of fluctuation in terms and in usage, and it can be very confusing, and that's okay. Right? That's absolutely okay. It's like keeping up with the kids and their TikTok slang, right? Like, I can't do that. However, once it settles out, we'll find out exactly what, society will kind of solidify around some usage. So currently, the usage that folks seem to have settled on is to default to they, them until we know otherwise. And it's, you're right to point out that, like, you were, prior to probably our conversation, or maybe even a little bit before that, but we're trained from birth to automatically, subconsciously gender people.
Yes.
And so it is a lot of reprogramming of our brains. Now, this is something we do for so many different parts of our lives, but we're not used to reprogramming the way that we identify people, right? We're not used to being asked to do that by an outside force, especially. So the first piece of advice that I have for folks who are approaching this and who are learning about this stuff is to be very compassionate with yourself, and not to beat yourself up, especially not in front of someone who you may have just misgendered. And we can get to that a little bit in the future, or a little bit later on. But yeah, I think the best thing is either to just stick with they, them, or to introduce yourself with your pronouns.
Yes.
So, hi, my name is Katie. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. How's it going? And what that does is it not only signals to people who are non-binary that, oh, hey, this person is like, they know the lingo a little bit, and they're also like comfortable learning about me. They're a safe person to have a conversation with, and if they mess up, it's not intentional. But it also, it says to people who use binary pronouns like myself, that you're trying, right? And that makes a huge difference, right? Because as we all know, like, while intent is not as important as impact, knowledge of intent can change the impact. And I think that's incredibly important. So to talk about like messing up pronouns, once you know someone's pronouns. So every once in a while, I'll still do it. I have a friend who is also binary-ish, or who was binary trans woman. And they recently started using they, them pronouns. And so for me, I'm like, I had solidified this person in my mind. I'm like, concrete, she, her, forever, till the day that they die. Like, that's it. But then they came out as non-binary, and they were talking about how, like, yeah, no, she, her was okay, but it felt really constricting for them. And so for me, when I mess up, it's as simple as pause, rewind, say the right pronoun, and keep going. Maybe a quick apology. But the biggest thing is to not make it about beating yourself up. No self-flagellation. This is not 14th century France. We don't need to beat ourselves up about this stuff, right? It's all about making it smooth, simple, and gentle, right?
And this, if I may, this is one of the thing, and one of the many things that I have learned from you, Katie, is going to that when we do mess up, because we will make mistakes as we're learning. That is part of the learning process. But can you go into a little bit more about that? You know, not making it about me and how horrible I feel that I've done this, and because that was another really big learning for me, that I never thought about the impact that would have on the other person. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that too.
Yeah. So I want to try an example. Okay. So say I was talking to my fiance, who is upstairs painting right now, I think, because, you know, we're an artist household. And after this call, I went up to her and I was like, hey, you know, I just had my call with Jocelyn. It went really, really well. That was pretty quick and easy, right? And I intentionally messed up your name, obviously, but the difference between that and oh, I just got off my call with JC. Oh, darn it. I can't. What is wrong with me? I keep Jocelyn. Sorry. Her name is Jocelyn. I just got off my call with Jocelyn and it went really, really well. Can't believe I did that. See the difference to what it does to the flow of a conversation, and you as a viewer, whether you yourself, Jocelyn, or anyone watching this, like, you can feel the cringe as I'm beating myself up, right? And so for myself as a trans person who is occasionally misgendered or dead named, where we call it dead naming because it is a name that we would like buried, most of us, also known as our birth name or our old name. Which is funny because it was a name I was given after birth, not during birth. That would have been weird. But anyways, so when those things happen, if someone decides that no, they're going to beat themselves up about it, usually it's because they're new to trying to navigate trans stuff and they thought they had it down. They thought they had it figured out. But what they didn't realize is, like, there's a lot of weird wiring in our brains and we can't always control what happens. So we just got to reinforce it with the right stuff, and then the wrong stuff will drift away, right? But if someone starts beating themselves up in front of me, then I have to worry about their feelings. And I've just been hurt. And so I've got to take time out of my self-protection and self-healing to navigate the feelings of someone who just stepped on my toe, right? Or in some cases, it feels more like a slap in the face. And so by doing that, really, you're asking said trans person or said person, like, if you mess up someone's name, you mess up someone's name. But you're making them take time out of their day and out of your interaction and asking them to do labor for you. So it's really, it's something that many of us are taught to do when we mess up, is to self-flagellate, and it is just not productive in any way, in any part of our lives, but especially not when we're dealing with someone who we've harmed, whether intentionally or not.
Right. Thank you for explaining that and sharing that, because that was a big learning, and I know something that I for sure can be, I'm very guilty of, because I do feel terrible, but when you phrased that and, shared with me in a way in that context, it made so much sense as to the impact that it has. So thank you for explaining that. So I wanted, if we can, there's a few language, like, I don't even know if nuance
Yeah.
is the right word, but just a couple of questions, and things that I have come across and questions that I've heard asked. So we have talked about pronouns and their link to, like, I guess, descriptor of gender, if that's the right way to describe it. So what is then is sex versus gender?
Okay. So this is one of those things that in a lot of ways we're still recalibrating socially, and therefore the language is still getting worked on. Okay.
Right.
But the best way you can think of it is sex is your body. Sex is we think of primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics. The things that happen at puberty, that sort of stuff, right? That's generally speaking, that's sex. However, there are a lot of folks who aren't quite on board with that interpretation, because that says that, oh, well, I'm a woman with a male body. And I don't really like that, the way that feels. Doesn't feel right. And then, so when we talk about gender, there are actually two things that you want to talk about with gender. There's gender identity,
Okay.
and then there's gender presentation. Okay.
Okay.
So we'll take all three of them kind of at once here. So gender identity is, and I'm gonna walk this back to like when we're kids. Okay. So gender identity is being a girl. Okay. Gender presentation is being a tomboy. Okay. Now, my sex, my genitals as a kid, as a prepubescent kid, nobody better be asking about my genitals, right? Right. Doesn't matter. Unless they're my doctor and they're going to see me, naked, and it comes into play or something, or later on it's someone who you're becoming intimate with.
Right.
Outside of those two situations, sex really only matters in the context of history. Okay. So when you think about people in your life, you think about first one that comes to mind right now, just because it's topical in my life, is one of my great uncles. So my great uncle he was in the Korean War. Okay. And it turned him into kind of an asshole. I mean, among other things, like, yeah, he's not a nice person. However, we can look at that as part of his history, and we can see how that may have impacted him. Not everybody who goes to war comes back quite impacted the way that he was. And, his impact wasn't as profound as that of someone else. But when it comes to, for me, I was assigned male at birth, which is just a fancy way of saying that when my mom pushed me out, the doctor smacked me on the ass and said it's a boy. Right? And that was really only because I had gonads on the outside of my body. That was it. That was the only criteria. Didn't take into context or like in any possible personal identities, obviously, but it also didn't take into context any kind of intersex conditions, pardon me. Not that those are necessarily wrapped up in gender in the same way that we might assume. However, so that's my history. That means that for me, I came out when I was 25. So I had 25 years of learning how to pretend to be a guy. Okay. And some of that was conscious, some of that was subconscious, right? A lot of it was things I did just naturally to survive. And now as a trans woman, for me, I like to keep that as a part of my identity, that past, because it has shaped who I am. It shaped my view of the world. It's to some degree or another shaped my hobbies, shaped the way that my parents treated me. Not nearly as much as others. I know some folks who grew up with very rigidly, or parents who really forced a rigid gender binary, but at the same time, I lived in the same world that you did. I saw all the messaging presented to women. So that got worked in there as well, because there's this part of me throughout my whole life before I figured out I was trans that was drawn inexplicably towards this stuff, right? And when I came out, my gender presentation went rather femme. It went quite feminine. And I never quite went what we would call high femme, you know. I've never been a big makeup person even then, but I dove into it. I was like, oh, awesome. This gender stuff is really cool. Or this girl stuff is really cool. But once I got settled into myself, I realized that no, I actually kind of am just a tomboy. You know, I'm a low maintenance physical or like visual. I don't want to put any work into this. My hair is the way it is because that's how I come out of the shower. I'm really lucky with that, by the way.
Your hair is beautiful.
Thank you. However, like that didn't change my gender. So realizing that the way I present myself didn't change the fact that no, actually deep down inside, I'm a woman. Mm-hmm. And that's the closest identity that I have found. Even though I'm kind of creeping into this non-binary world, this world outside of gender or without gender. And yeah, there's the overlap between my gender presentation and my gender identity is, I don't know, probably 50-50. But you go back to the 40s, and the only thing feminine about how I look is this. Everything else about how I look is masculine. I wear shirts and jeans and don't wear, you know, heels or anything like that. I wear runners and boots, and those are all things that a past generation would have said made me male, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but to go back to sex for a minute, biological sex. So there's a couple of things that are really neat that I have learned. So I started a few years ago, started seeing people talk about, oh, well, so gender is subjective and it is manufactured. It's something that we made up, right? Gender is made up. Like, oh, okay, you know, that makes sense to me, because as a trans person, my gender was made up for 25 years. And then one day I was like, right, I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna do this. And then I started making up my new gender, right? But then I started to see people talk about sex being made up, being invented. And then I started it being subjective. And there's something really interesting when you look at how we, quote unquote, how we sex people or beings. Sometimes we sex them via their gonads, right? Generally, humans are sexed via our gonads. Sometimes we have creatures on this planet, there are animals that have zero sexual dimorphism, physical sexual dimorphism. And so they're identical, whether it's someone who, or, you know, a bird that is sexed male or female, or an insect or whatever, right? And then you start to think, okay, so where's the line then? At what point does one change in a gene just distinguish what we call a genotype from a phenotype, right? Or at what point does, what point does a different appearance denote a different phenotype? And you find that, like, at each point we make a subjective decision, right? You've probably heard, you know, XX and XY, right? Well, XX being female, XY being male. There's like a vanishingly small percentage of humans on this planet who have actually been genotyped. So we do not know if you or I are XX or XY, right? We assume that there's a direct correlation. But in fact, when you start to look into the science of it, turns out that no, actually just most of the time, the genetic marker for androgen sensitivity, i.e. their body is more sensitive to testosterone, it is just more likely to rest on the Y gene as opposed to the X gene. So you can have XY with androgen insensitivity, you can have XX with androgen hypersensitivity, and that's where you start seeing intersex conditions, right? We don't know how many people are intersex. We really have no idea. We would have to genotype everybody, and that's a huge undertaking, and it's pointless. Really, it is, because the fact of the matter is, intersex conditions are just as natural as sex conditions or binary sex conditions. But when you start with, again, with that foundation, and then you start looking at, like, okay, well, boobs are not boobs, right? Testes are not testes, ovaries are not ovaries. Then you see that a lot of that is just us making groupings that are fairly subjective. They're not arbitrary. They make sense, like there's rules to them, but they are not hard and fast. And so when you start with that, then you start going, oh, so someone who was born male doesn't really make sense, but someone who was assigned male at birth means that someone looked at them and made a determination. And that determination was based on criteria that are, for all intents and purposes, subjective. So I was assigned male at birth. As I understand it, you were assigned female at birth. My gender is female. Your gender is female. Both of our gender presentations are female. My sexuality is bisexual. I'm not sure what your sexuality is because we haven't talked about it, but that kind of tells you, you know, it's ways of talking about ourselves that, were we to completely wipe the cultural memory and start fresh, blank slate, wouldn't matter. However, because of the cultural memory that we have, because of what happened through the churches, through various societies enforcing their will on each other, through various individuals enforcing their will on society, we are here. And so that's why all of this inclusive language is important, I think, because, you know, we have a lot of reason to come up with words for all of the amazing ways that humans present themselves to each other.
Yes. Oh, Katie, you are an exceptional human, and everything
Thank you.
You are. And I just, even like, in you just kind of like listing out those layers of yourself and how they all, like, there's so many aspects and pieces to you, and we don't need to fit in this little conformed box that makes us feel like
No,
we get it, right? But like, it's just all of that makes you the beautiful human that you are. And there's so many layers to it. Like, it's not A and B, like, and it doesn't have to be, right?
exactly. And I think there's, there's categories and categories and categories, and it's all confusing.
Yeah.
And it's all supposed to be confusing because people are a wonderful mess. And that's what I love so much about humanity. That's why I tell stories in my documentaries of a variety of people, because we are a wonderful mess. And I think that, just as a kind of final thought on the labels side of things, or the boxes side of things, is that for myself, I found that the older I've gotten, I'm 33 now, the less my labels have mattered, because they've helped me find myself. However, the only labels that have mattered are those that have been self-applied. Those that are applied to me by someone else are generally destructive, in my experience,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And I've struggled with this because I'm also someone who very much lives in my brain really wants to see a diametric black and white existence. I want to be able to draw within the lines. And so for me, one thing that was just mind-blowing was the first time I met someone who I would consider transgender, who did not identify as such.
Oh,
And so while they technically, yes, they fall under the trans umbrella, right? They were assigned a different gender than that which was or that which they identify with. For me to apply that label to them was offensive.
okay.
And so this is, again, a case of letting people give you the context that they want to give you, whatever that ends up being. Especially for me, it's, the struggle is talking to people who are older than me and have navigated different parts of this language journey than I have, but haven't done it with the same context that I have. So people who've, gone through, people who came out as trans back in the 80s, would have called themselves transsexuals or transvestites.
Right.
And those are words we really don't like now, because they were applied to us by someone, a doctor, who was essentially saying that we were all fetishists, that the only reason why our gender identity was coming out in this way had nothing to do with who we really were as people, but it was all a fetishization of the female form. And so to look at transsexual and transvestite and say, oh yeah, that's me, doesn't work for me. But I've met a good number of trans people who do fit that umbrella, or do use those labels,
Right.
because that is where they found their safety. So again, with the incredible mess that we are, right? Whereas transgender is actually something that a trans person, as far as I know, a trans person sat down and went, yes, let's go with this. And another trans person said, oh yes, I concur, let's do that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Katie, I could talk to you and talk to you for hours, because you have such an incredible way of sharing and teaching, and you do it with story, which is clearly why you are a gifted storyteller and filmmaker. But I don't want to monopolize your time. I do want to ask if we can close with one almost rapid fire. And what I would love to know is if there were some words or terms that we should be eliminating from our daily word base right now. What are some of those things? And I know there's probably a lot, but I would love to know from your perspective, what are some of those things that we right now, society as a whole, we should be working really hard to eliminate them from our vocabulary?
So the first one that comes to mind is and we've already touched on it, but this assigned at birth versus born as a.
Okay.
Easy one to do, because, you know, someone was born as a boy, was assigned a boy or assigned male at birth. Another one that comes to mind, and this is broader. This is bigger. This is like, if 50 years from now I met someone from the future and one thing could change about their lexicon, this would be it. It would be, I would like to change the fact that we gender our children. Now, this is kind of, for a lot of folks, this is a really big idea. But there are a lot of folks who are implementing this in beautiful and effective ways, and just using they, them pronouns with someone until that child has the voice to express themselves. I know there's a lot of conversation and fear mongering around like trans kids right now, but let me tell you, after working with trans youth aged 13 and under for the last 4 years, and we just had our fourth camp, and after working with these kids, like I can honestly say that it is incredible what happens when parents just step back and let the kids identify as they will, even if that changes 6 times in a year and it drives you up the wall. It's a parenting sacrifice. Do it, because oh my goodness, the self-confidence that comes with being able to determine your own path is just beautiful.
Wow. That is, I have not heard that before, heard that insight, and that's very powerful. And for you working, like directly with these youth and seeing the difference that can make, I mean, what other proof do you need?
Right? I've had the opportunity to watch a number of our campers grow up into their gender, and I was actually just saying to one of the other people who leads the group that I am involved with, and we were just awed by the core being that is developed when you have a child who is allowed to self-actualize. And just in case anyone is watching this and wondering, well, like, what does that mean? Does that mean surgeries, or does that mean legal name change, or whatever? It doesn't have to. And for most kids, surgeons won't touch them until they hit 18.
Okay.
There are one thing that a lot of trans kids and their parents will pursue is puberty blockers, which almost defers a lot of the changes that would happen. And for me, and I don't know if you can see this on camera, but I've still got some facial hair here, right? So had I come out for me, it would have been super early, like 11, because my family is hairy. But had I been on puberty blockers, it would have saved me so much heartache and so much money,
Right.
as an adult, undoing a lot of that can be done. And the heartache is mostly learning to accept and live with that which can't be undone. And going through that process, that is huge. So I'm a big proponent of letting kids decide, and like parents getting out of the way. It's amazing what happens.
Wow. Katie, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing so openly and for creating a space with so much grace and compassion, and for the emotional labor that you undertook to share and educate us today, because I do want to acknowledge and recognize that this we all need to do our own work and do our own research. And the fact that you took time and the effort and the energy to do this, I just want you to know how much I appreciate it and how much I appreciate you. So thank you so much for your time today, Katie. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn. And I just want to say, like, if, you know, for me, again, like I said, this is a processing mechanism, right? This is a defense mechanism almost. But if an hour of my labor helps a couple of people get a leg up on doing less harm to the people around them and learning, and makes that learning easier, oh, that makes my heart sing, and I love it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Katie.